*** 10 key turning points for the story ***. 1. ***, the isolated orphanage ***, deep in the woods of Pennsylvania, the St. Helena Catholic Orphanage stood as a solemn monument of faith, built in 1894 for God's lost children. The first signs of something wrong began when Sister Agnes reported strange noises from the basement chapel. 2. ***, the first disappearance ***, a quiet boy named Matthew vanished during evening prayers in 1928. The sisters claimed he wandered into the forest, but his shoes were later found beside the altar, still warm. 3. ***, whispers in the hallways ***, children began whispering about a woman without eyes who visited their dormitory at night, humming lullabies only they could hear. 4. ***, the confession book ***, Sister Miriam discovered a hidden confessional record dating back to the orphanage's early years, containing cryptic penances written in Latin, some ending with the words "return to the earth." 5. ***, the flooded cellar ***, heavy rain exposed a sealed trapdoor beneath the chapel. The priest forbade entry, claiming it was forbidden ground, but a few brave children ventured near and heard soft knocking from below. 6. ***, the disappearance pattern ***, over the next 3 years, a total of 14 children vanished without a trace. Their names were quietly erased from church records as if they had never existed. 7. ***, the new caretaker's discovery ***, a former war medic hired to maintain the grounds unearthed a decayed rosary tangled in a child's hair while clearing the garden. That night, he heard footsteps echoing outside his quarters, barefoot and pacing. 8. ***, the secret tunnel ***, a surviving orphan, now grown, returned decades later and revealed that beneath the orphanage ran a narrow tunnel leading to a hollow where the sisters went to pray without God. 9. ***, the mass grave ***, excavations near the site in the 1970s uncovered small skeletal remains, all with rosary beads clutched in their hands, but the church intervened before identification could be completed. 10. ***, the final revelation ***, a recovered journal from the head nun described a pact made to protect the faith through unholy sacrifice, believing that certain children were chosen to atone for the sins of mankind. Story introduction ***. Rain slid down the warped wooden cross that crowned St. Helena Orphanage, dripping like dark tears over its moss-covered roof. The forest surrounding it was unnaturally quiet, as if the trees themselves had long learned to keep secrets. 4 miles around, no birds sang, no wind dared to stir the thick air that clung to the old convent walls. On stormy nights, the bells above the chapel rang by themselves, slow, mournful tolls that echoed through the valley and made even the most devout villagers cross themselves before blowing out their lamps. Inside, the corridors smelled of candle wax and damp stone. The children slept in narrow beds lined in perfect rows, their dreams thick with whispers. It was said that if one awoke between the chimes of 3 and 4, they might see her, the figure in the black veil standing by the door, head slightly tilted, humming a tune no human voice should know. The sisters prayed more often now, their lips trembling as they recited the rosary. Some claimed the walls wept during Mass, streaks of crimson trickling down the plaster like veins. Others said the earth beneath the orphanage was hollow, breathing like something alive. No one could explain why the children vanished. No one dared to ask. But every empty bed left behind seemed to sigh softly at night, as though the child who once slept there still lingered waiting, watching, whispering their last prayer into the dark woods beyond. The St. Helena Catholic Orphanage stood deep in the heart of the Pennsylvania woods, far from the reach of curious townsfolk and the noise of the modern world. It was built in 1894 by a small order of nuns who believed that isolation would bring purity, that distance from sin would nurture souls untarnished by the outside. The building itself was imposing yet strangely beautiful, a sprawling stone structure crowned by a crooked bell tower that seemed to pierce the fog, its windows tall and narrow, its corridors long and cold. For decades, it was home to dozens of unwanted children, many of them left on its steps with nothing but a blanket and a prayer card bearing their names. The sisters ran the orphanage with stern devotion, rising before dawn to pray and filling every hour of the day with discipline, silence, and scripture. Yet beneath that veil of holiness, something darker had always lingered. Sister Agnes was the first to notice it. Late one November night in 1928, as she extinguished the chapel candles, she heard a faint tapping sound echoing up from beneath the altar. She paused, listening, and then dismissed it as the shifting of old wood or the murmurs of her imagination. But the sound came again the next night, and the one after, growing louder and more rhythmic, like knuckles rapping against stone. Soon the other sisters began to complain of strange noises as well, soft footfalls in the hall when no one was there, whispers curling from the corners of empty rooms, the faint scent of burning wax even when every candle had been snuffed out. When she reported it to the head nun, Mother Superior insisted that the devil often tested the faithful with illusions, and that prayer was the only answer. But Sister Agnes could not shake the feeling that something inside the chapel was alive. The children began to sense it too. They told stories of a shadow that lingered near the altar, of cold drafts that slipped through their blankets at night even when the windows were shut. One little girl said she saw a figure kneeling before the cross during morning prayers, a woman in black whose face was hidden by a veil, her hands clasped so tightly in prayer that blood dripped from her knuckles. No one believed her at first. But when the girl woke the next morning, she was feverish and trembling, whispering a single phrase over and over, "She's still down there." From that night on, no one wanted to go near the chapel after dark. The sound from beneath the altar never stopped, and St. Helena's began to lose its sense of sanctuary, becoming instead a place of quiet dread where even the most faithful whispered their prayers in fear. The first disappearance at St. Helena Orphanage happened on a rain-soaked evening in the spring of 1928, when the children were gathered in the chapel for nightly prayers. The storm outside had turned the sky black, and every flash of lightning cast fleeting shadows through the tall stained-glass windows, twisting the faces of saints into something unrecognizable. Among the children kneeling before the altar was Matthew, a quiet 8-year-old boy with pale eyes and a habit of staring too long at the crucifix. He had been at the orphanage for nearly 3 years, left there after his mother succumbed to illness. The sisters often described him as gentle and obedient, though the other children whispered that he talked to someone who wasn't there. That night, Sister Agnes noticed Matthew trembling, his lips moving silently long after the prayers had ended. When she placed a hand on his shoulder, he flinched and whispered, "She keeps calling my name." When the storm finally broke and the candles were extinguished, the children were led back to their dormitories. The sound of thunder faded into distant rumbling, and for a while, silence returned to St. Helena's. But when Sister Agnes came to check the rooms before curfew, Matthew's bed was empty. His blanket was still warm, his rosary draped across his pillow, and muddy footprints trailed from his bedside toward the hallway. The prints stopped abruptly near the chapel door, as if the boy had vanished mid-step. The sisters searched every corridor, every closet, even the forest edge, calling his name into the dark, but there was no answer, only the soft echo of their voices swallowed by the rain. By morning, the head nun declared that Matthew must have wandered into the woods during the storm. The local sheriff arrived but found no tracks beyond the chapel, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle. The only clue lay beside the altar, Matthew's small leather shoes, still damp and neatly placed together as if he had removed them willingly. The sisters gathered around them in silence, each afraid to voice what she felt that the boy hadn't left of his own accord. That same day, one of the youngest orphans claimed she had seen him standing near the altar during the night, barefoot and smiling, his eyes blank as marble. She said he was humming a lullaby none of them had ever heard before. From that moment, the children refused to pray near the altar, and the sisters began locking the chapel doors after sunset. The official report said Matthew was lost to the wilderness, but among those who lived within those cold stone walls, everyone knew the forest had not taken him. Something else had. After Matthew's disappearance, the orphanage changed in ways that no one could explain. The air inside the dormitories grew colder even when the fire burned, and the children began waking up screaming in the middle of the night. They spoke of whispers coming from the corners of the room, of lullabies sung in voices that were neither kind nor human. The most disturbing stories, however, were about a figure they called the woman without eyes. It started with the younger children, the ones too small to invent such horrors. They claimed she would stand at the end of their beds after midnight, her black veil floating slightly as if stirred by a breeze that no one else could feel. Some said she would reach out a pale hand toward them, but before she could touch them, she would vanish, leaving behind the faint scent of lilies and something sour, like decay. Sister Agnes dismissed it as fear born from tragedy. She told the children that dreams could trick the heart, that grief had ways of creeping into their sleep. But even she could not ignore the pattern that followed. Every few nights, one or more of the orphans would wake screaming at the same hour, 3:23 in the morning, and insist that the woman had been standing beside their bed, humming the same melody that Matthew was said to have sung before he disappeared. The older children tried to protect the younger ones, sleeping closer together, clutching their rosaries tight under the covers. Yet the visits did not stop. One night, a child named Clara claimed to have seen the woman more clearly than anyone else. She said the figure wore the old black habit of a nun, but her face was wrong, smooth, pale, and featureless where her eyes should have been, as if someone had pressed wax over them. Clara said she whispered the same words over and over in a trembling voice: "He is not gone, he is waiting." When Sister Agnes found Clara hiding under her bed the next morning, she was shaking and refused to open her eyes for days. Rumors spread quickly among the staff. A few of the older nuns confessed that they too had heard the humming echoing through the hallways after lights out. The sound would move slowly down the corridor, stopping at each door, pausing just long enough to make the heart pound before continuing on. The Mother Superior ordered more prayers and longer fasts, insisting that the devil preyed on weakness. But as the weeks went on, the whispers grew louder, and every shadow in the orphanage seemed to hold a shape. The name "the woman without eyes" became a curse that no one dared to speak aloud, for fear that doing so would summon her back. Sister Miriam was known among the sisters for her curiosity, a quiet defiance hidden beneath layers of obedience and prayer. When the disappearances began to haunt St. Helena's, she could not simply accept them as acts of divine mystery or punishment. Late at night, while the others slept, she searched the records room, a cramped chamber filled with yellowed papers and cracked leather ledgers that smelled of mold and candle smoke. It was there, behind a stack of unused hymnals, that she discovered the confession book, a thick, dust-covered volume bound in dark green leather, older than the orphanage itself. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes in faded ink, each entry bearing a date, a name, and a sin. But what unsettled her were the penances written beside them. Instead of simple prayers or acts of repentance, the book contained phrases in Latin, many of which she could barely translate. Some repeated the phrase reverteta ad terram, return to the earth. Others mentioned purification through sacrifice. The handwriting changed halfway through the book, becoming frantic, as if written by a trembling hand. The sins listed were no longer of ordinary men or women but of the innocents in care. Sister Miriam felt a chill as she realized that the innocents could only mean the children. One entry, dated decades earlier, spoke of offering their purity for the salvation of the many. Another page had been violently scratched out, the ink so thick it had torn through the parchment. The further she read, the more she felt the weight of something unholy pressing on her chest. She turned the final pages only to find that they were blank except for one faint mark drawn at the bottom corner of the last sheet, a small cross surrounded by a circle, the symbol carved into the chapel altar where the first strange noises had been heard. Terrified but determined, Sister Miriam brought the book to Mother Superior the next morning, her hands shaking as she placed it on the desk. The older nun's face paled at the sight of it, though she quickly composed herself and closed the book without reading a single line. She told Miriam that the confession book was not meant for mortal eyes and that speaking of it would invite darkness back into the house of God. When Miriam tried to argue, the Mother Superior ordered her to burn the book in the chapel furnace and pray for forgiveness. But that night, when the furnace was checked, only ashes remained, though no one could say for certain what had burned. The following morning, the faint scent of smoke lingered in the chapel, and the same Latin phrase from the book appeared carved into the wood beneath the crucifix, as if written by invisible hands. The rains that came that spring were unlike anything the sisters could remember. For weeks, the sky remained grey and swollen, and the forest that surrounded St. Helena seemed to draw closer with each passing day. The ground trembled under the constant downpour, and rivulets of muddy water ran through the orphanage courtyard, seeping into the cracks of the old stone chapel. It was during one of these storms that a section of the chapel floor caved in near the altar, revealing a trapdoor long hidden beneath the tiles. The wood was soaked and swollen, sealed shut with rusted iron hinges that looked centuries old. When the sisters gathered to examine it, Mother Superior's face turned pale. She ordered it to be covered immediately and forbade anyone from touching it, claiming it was part of the orphanage's early foundation and best left undisturbed. But curiosity spread through the halls faster than her warnings. At night, the children began whispering about the door. They said it moved on its own when the rain fell hardest, that a soft knocking could be heard from beneath it, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was trapped below. Some swore they heard faint weeping echoing up from the cracks, others said they saw a thin mist rise from it when the chapel candles burned low. Sister Agnes, who had grown increasingly uneasy since Matthew's disappearance, claimed she once felt the ground tremble beneath her feet as she prayed before the altar. When she looked down, she saw moisture seeping between the floorboards near the trapdoor, but it wasn't rainwater, it was thick, dark, and warm. A few of the older boys dared each other to approach the door during the night. One evening, 2 of them crept into the chapel after lights out, carrying only a single candle. They later told the other children that when they leaned close, they heard what sounded like a woman's voice whispering prayers in Latin from below. But the voice wasn't calm, it was pleading. Before they could run, the candle was snuffed out by a sudden gust, and the trapdoor rattled violently beneath them, as though something below was pounding to be let out. They fled screaming, and for days afterward, refused to enter the chapel again. Mother Superior had the area boarded over, covering it with heavy oak planks and a thick carpet embroidered with crosses. But it did little to silence the sounds. The knocking continued through the nights, always faint but constant, echoing through the stone floors of St. Helena's. The nuns pretended not to hear it, yet some began avoiding their evening prayers altogether. Deep down, each of them knew the truth they could not say aloud. The thing beneath the chapel was not new. It had been there long before any of them arrived, waiting for the rain to loosen the earth and reveal its hiding place once more. In the years that followed the discovery of the trapdoor, silence became a way of life at St. Helena's. The children spoke in hushed tones, and even laughter felt like an act of rebellion against the cold, heavy air that filled the orphanage. It was as if the building itself was listening, waiting for something. One by one, the children began to disappear, always under strange and quiet circumstances. The first few were dismissed as accidents, runaways, the Mother Superior claimed, though no one had ever seen a child make it past the edge of the forest alive. But the disappearances did not stop. They came in waves, spaced months apart, until 14 names were gone from the attendance lists, and 14 beds stood empty. Each loss was followed by a night of prayer, candlelight flickering over pale faces as the sisters begged for divine intervention. Yet no answers ever came. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The missing were always the youngest, the ones most frightened of the chapel, the ones who had spoken about the whispers or the woman without eyes. They vanished most often after heavy rain, when the chapel floors grew damp and the air carried the faint scent of lilies and decay. The sisters stopped keeping written records of the incidents after the 5th child disappeared, fearful that documentation might bring attention from the outside world. Those who asked questions were silenced with scripture, told that faith required trust in mystery. The priest who visited monthly began to notice the dwindling numbers, but each time he inquired, Mother Superior assured him that the children had been relocated to better homes. He accepted her explanation without pressing further, leaving behind his blessings and averted eyes. By the 3rd year, the orphanage had changed completely. The sound of laughter had vanished. The younger orphans clung to each other at night, refusing to sleep unless someone held their hand. The nuns prayed more often, their faces gaunt from fasting and sleepless nights. Some whispered that they could hear small footsteps in the chapel long after the doors had been locked. Others claimed to see flickers of candlelight moving beneath the cracks of the boarded floor where the trapdoor had once been. And though the church insisted on silence, word began to spread among nearby villagers, rumors of strange hymns echoing from the woods at night, of ghostly figures walking in the rain. Then, one morning, a man who supplied food to the orphanage noticed something strange, a new name carved into the chapel doorframe, one that hadn't been there before. It was Matthew's, etched deep into the wood, followed by 13 small crosses underneath. When the Mother Superior saw it, she turned pale, ordered it sanded off, and forbade anyone to speak of it again. But by then, the truth was already buried deeper than words could reach. In the fall of 1931, after the orphanage had nearly emptied of children and silence had settled like a shroud over the halls, a new caretaker arrived. His name was Thomas Hale, a former army medic who had served during the Great War. He was a quiet man, hardened by what he'd seen in the trenches, but still carrying a gentleness that made him seem almost out of place among the stern sisters. The church had sent him to tend to the crumbling grounds of St. Helena's, repairing fences, cutting back the encroaching forest, and maintaining the gardens that had long been left to rot. He was told nothing of the orphanage's history, only that the sisters preferred solitude and that he should not ask questions. From his first day, however, he felt that something about the place was wrong. The air was heavy, unnaturally still, and the forest beyond the chapel seemed to pulse with a quiet rhythm, as if it were breathing. While clearing weeds behind the chapel one afternoon, Hale struck something solid beneath the soil. Kneeling down, he brushed away the mud and uncovered what looked like a decayed string of wooden beads. At first, he thought it was a rosary, but as he lifted it free, his stomach turned. Tangled among the beads was a lock of matted hair, brittle and pale, unmistakably human. He stared at it for a long time before reburying it, not out of fear but respect, whispering a prayer for whoever it might have belonged to. When he mentioned it to Sister Agnes later that evening, her face went white. She told him quietly that the garden was sacred ground and that he was never to dig there again. She would not explain why. That night, as rain began to fall, Hale was awoken by the sound of footsteps outside his small quarters. They were soft, almost childlike, and came in slow, uneven paces, circling his cabin. Thinking it was one of the sisters, he called out, but the footsteps stopped immediately. When he stepped outside with his lantern, no one was there, only the faint impression of small, barefoot tracks in the mud leading toward the chapel. The next morning, he followed the tracks, but they vanished abruptly at the chapel doors, as though their maker had been swallowed whole by the earth. From then on, he began hearing other things at night, low voices whispering in unison, the faint creak of the chapel bell, though the rope had long been removed. The sisters avoided his questions, their eyes shadowed by fear. Hale, who had once faced the horrors of war, began to feel something worse here, a silence that breathed, a darkness that watched. By the time the first frost came, he no longer slept without keeping a candle burning beside his bed, its flame trembling with every unseen breath that passed through the walls of St. Helena's. Nearly 4 decades later, in the late 1970s, when the orphanage had long been abandoned and the forest had reclaimed most of its grounds, a man returned to St. Helena's who had once called it home. His name was Samuel Granger, one of the last children to survive the orphanage before it was closed down by the church. He had grown into a quiet, reclusive man who carried the kind of stillness that comes from witnessing things that never quite fade. Samuel had spent his adult years trying to forget what had happened there, but the nightmares never left him. They always began the same way, with the sound of a lullaby echoing from beneath the chapel floor and the faint image of a dark figure kneeling by his bed. When word spread that construction crews planned to tear down what remained of the orphanage to build a retreat center, Samuel knew he had to return. He claimed that something inside those walls was still alive, waiting. When he arrived, the building was little more than a skeleton, roof collapsed, windows shattered, vines crawling through the corridors. The smell of rot and damp would clung to the air. Samuel moved slowly through the ruins, guided only by memory, until he reached what had once been the chapel. The altar was gone, the floorboards warped and broken, but the trapdoor he remembered as a child was still there, hidden beneath a layer of earth and debris. He knelt and traced the edges with his fingers, whispering the same prayer the sisters had taught them decades ago. That was when he saw it, a faint gap near the wall where part of the floor had collapsed. Behind it lay the entrance to a narrow tunnel, small enough that a grown man would have to crawl through. The air that drifted from it was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of incense and soil. Samuel said later that he hesitated for nearly an hour before lighting a candle and crawling inside. The tunnel walls were carved from stone, etched with faint symbols that matched the ones once painted behind the altar. He followed the path until it opened into a hollow chamber beneath the earth, large enough to hold a dozen people. At the center stood remnants of an old wooden cross and several stone benches arranged in a circle. He realized then that this was where the sisters had gone to pray, where the whispers had come from. But what chilled him most were the marks on the walls, handprints, small and childlike, pressed deep into the stone. When he emerged from the tunnel, the candle had burned nearly to nothing, and though the forest outside was still, Samuel swore he could hear the faint sound of children singing behind him, their voices echoing from somewhere deep underground. In 1976, a group of state investigators and historians arrived at the site of the old St. Helena Orphanage after reports surfaced from hikers who claimed to have found fragments of bone near the crumbling chapel foundation. The church had long denied any wrongdoing, insisting the building's closure decades earlier had been due to structural decay and funding shortages, but whispers of missing records and erased names had never faded from local memory. When excavation began, what started as a simple survey quickly turned into something far more chilling. Beneath the soil near the back garden, the same place where Thomas Hale once found the rosary, workers unearthed small skeletal remains. The bones were fragile, weathered by time, yet unmistakably human. They belonged to children, each no older than 10. At first, only 2 sets were discovered, but as the digging continued, more appeared, all buried in shallow, uneven graves arranged in a rough semicircle. What disturbed investigators most was that every skeleton was found holding a rosary. The beads were clutched tightly in tiny hands, some fused to the bone by decades of decay. A few of the skulls bore faint fractures, though it was unclear whether they had been caused before or after death. Near one of the remains, a rusted silver cross was found engraved with a Latin phrase, pro redemption animarum, for the redemption of souls. It was the same phrase found in the old confession book that Sister Miriam had once uncovered. As word spread, journalists and locals flocked to the site, demanding answers. Former parishioners whispered of rituals, of prayers that had taken place in the tunnels beneath the chapel where light could not reach. Some spoke of a doctrine twisted by desperation, of nuns who believed they were chosen to purify sin through innocence. The church, alarmed by the attention, intervened almost immediately. Within days, the excavation was halted, and officials from the diocese arrived to take control of all findings. The bones were collected, labeled as historical remains, and transferred to an undisclosed location. No further digging was permitted, and the area was fenced off under the guise of preservation. But not everyone was convinced. Several workers later claimed that strange things happened during the excavation, that they heard soft humming beneath the ground and that their tools would sometimes go missing, only to reappear near the chapel steps. One man swore he saw a figure in a black veil standing by the tree line, watching silently as they unearthed the last grave. When he looked again, she was gone. After the church sealed the site, heavy rains washed away what little evidence remained, leaving behind only a few broken rosaries and the unshakable feeling that something sacred and terrible had been buried there long before anyone dared to speak of it. Years after the church's intervention, a local historian researching religious institutions in rural Pennsylvania came across an artifact that would reopen the horrors of St. Helena's. Hidden inside a locked wooden chest preserved in the archives of a nearby convent was a weathered journal, its pages brittle and stained, belonging to the last head nun of St. Helena Orphanage, Mother Superior Beatrice. Her handwriting was meticulous, precise, and cold, as though each letter had been written with deliberate restraint. At first, the entries seemed ordinary, records of daily prayers, ration lists, and attendance logs. But as the pages progressed into the late 1920s, the tone shifted. Her words became fragmented, filled with guilt and fear, hinting at a growing darkness beneath the chapel. She wrote of dreams that haunted her, of children's voices echoing through the walls long after lights out, of a presence she could neither see nor defy. Then, buried between 2 pages stuck together by age and dampness, came the revelation that would change everything. Beatrice confessed that decades earlier, a visiting priest had told her of an ancient covenant once practiced by a small sect within the church, a ritual of atonement meant to restore divine balance by offering up the most innocent lives to cleanse the sins of humanity. He called it the Pact of Reclamation. She wrote that St. Helena's, isolated and forgotten, had been chosen as the perfect vessel for such devotion. At first, she refused, but the priest promised salvation, claiming the orphanage's continued prosperity depended on faith through sacrifice. Over time, Beatrice began to believe that the disappearances were not crimes but callings. She convinced herself that the children were chosen, that their souls were being taken not by darkness, but by God Himself. Her final entries were almost unreadable, scrawled in uneven handwriting that looked more like the work of a trembling hand than a steady one. She spoke of hearing the voices of the taken beneath the chapel, of the sound of knocking growing louder each night, and of seeing the veiled woman, the one the children feared, standing at the altar, whispering prayers Beatrice could not understand. She wrote that she finally realized her mistake too late, that the thing she had worshipped was not divine but ancient, feeding on faith and fear alike. The last line in the journal read simply, "The earth remembers. The innocent do not forgive." When the historian tried to verify the document's authenticity, the convent where it was stored burned in a mysterious fire. No copies of the journal survived, and the church once again denied the story as fabrication. Yet those who had seen it swore that the final pages were stained not with ink, but with fingerprints the color of rust, as though someone or something had tried to hold them shut.